and welcome to the Watchman. Well, what a year it has been. In 2014, we saw a 50-day war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. We saw Vladimir Putin's Russia seize the Crimea from Ukraine and threaten to go even further. We saw Iran continue to advance towards a nuclear weapon as it strings the West along and along. We saw President Obama refuse to secure our southern border as he granted amnesty to millions of undocumented immigrants. And of course, we saw the rise of ISIS, the most barbaric Islamic terrorist group in modern history. As the ISIS caliphate continues to grow and literally change the map of the Middle East, it is drawing thousands of Westerners into its ranks. Other ISIS sympathizers have chose to stay home and carry out lone wolf attacks in their own countries. For me, that was one of the biggest developments of 2014 as we saw self-starter jihadi attacks in Oklahoma, New York City, Canada, and Australia. Here's what I said about that back in October. What I fear is that now that ISIS has emerged in such a powerful way, ladies and gentlemen, and they're resonating with young Muslims across the West. Look, we've had up to 3,000 Western passport holders leave their comfortable lives in Britain, Denmark, the United States, France, etc., and travel to Iraq and Syria and join ISIS. Number one, I'm afraid that some of them may come home and bring the jihad here. But number two, and an even immediate threat, are people here who sympathize with ISIS who have never traveled to Syria and Iraq. They may never have left the United States. Maybe they were radicalized online. We know that ISIS is so media savvy. It's just a new level in what they're doing on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram. So what I'm concerned about is that ISIS sympathizers are going to attempt to turn the United States into a battlefield. And what I mean is really an insurgency on American soil, folks, a guerrilla war type situation. You know, folks, this is a trend I've been warning about for years now, and with ISIS's emergence and the unprecedented way it is connecting with radicals throughout the world, this self-starter, one-man jihad trend is only going to get worse in 2015 here in the West. So what we want to do on the show this week is take a look forward into what is coming in 2015 while also taking a look back at the past year, which was earth-shattering in many ways. A bit later in the show, we'll talk to a leading Israeli analyst to get his take on what is coming in the Middle East. But up first, as I said, one trend that promises to increase is American and European citizens jumping aboard the ISIS bandwagon. Here in America, the number one hotspot for ISIS recruitment is not New York or Los Angeles, but Minnesota. That's right, the American heartland. The twin cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul have sent more Islamic terrorists overseas than any other region in the country. Imagine that. I paid a visit there in September to take a closer look at the Minnesota jihad pipeline. It's hard to imagine America's heartland as a breeding ground for terrorism. Yet when news emerged that 2 U.S. citizens had been killed in Syria fighting alongside ISIS, the path led back to, of all places, Minnesota. The 2 men were part of a growing number of young Muslims from Minneapolis and St. Paul who have answered the call of jihad. At least a dozen young Muslims from here in the Twin Cities have left their homes to travel to the Middle East and join ISIS. Some of them worshipped at this mosque in a quiet suburb of Minneapolis. An Egyptian-American man allegedly recruited young Somali Muslims from the Al Farouk Mosque and helped send them to Syria. Mosque officials say they banned Amir Mashal earlier this year when they learned he was preaching jihad. The suspected terror recruiter remains at large.
Usually there's one principal person that is what I call the guide of the person that can take this person in this ideological state and guide them to Syria or wherever it might be.
Bob Fletcher is the former sheriff for Ramsey County, which includes the city of St. Paul. He now works with Somali leaders to battle radicalism in their Twin Cities community, which has seen dozens of young men travel overseas to join terrorist groups in recent years.
They need to procure travel documents. They need to raise money, usually somewhere in the area of $4,000 to $5,000 to help facilitate all the travel that takes place. And plus they want to have money when they get there. And they need to make sure that someone is purchasing the tickets. That requires a credit card of some source to get to, and they need a driver and a facilitator to get them to the airport.
The recent deadly attacks against Canadian soldiers and the Canadian Parliament by ISIS sympathizers were another reminder of the chaos that just a handful of terrorists can cause on Western soil. It's estimated that as many as 3,000 Western passport holders from places like Canada, Britain, France, and the United States are fighting for the Islamic State. FBI Director James Comey and Attorney General Eric Holder both said recently that 12 Americans are fighting with ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Other Obama administration officials have said that at least 100 U.S. citizens overall have traveled to Syria to join terrorist groups. According to Democrat Congressman Tim Bishop, up to 40 of those American jihadists have already come home.
Those 40 are under FBI attention and surveillance, so they are known and they are being tracked by the FBI.
One suspected American the FBI is tracking starred in this recent ISIS propaganda video called Flames of War, where he executed Syrian troops.
We're here in the 17th Division military base just outside the city of Al-Raqqa, and we're here with the soldiers of Bashar. You can see them now digging their own graves in the very place where they were stationed.
A major concern is that ISIS recruits will return to the United States and carry out attacks here. Fletcher says ISIS sympathizers on U.S. soil who have never traveled overseas but were self-radicalized at home may be the more immediate threat.
I think it's a far greater concern that people that are here and radicalized that haven't gone back might strike out against America.
Coming up, what is next for the Middle East? We talked to a leading Israeli analyst about what to watch for in the world's most chaotic region in 2015. Don't move. And welcome back. Well, it's not hard to see that the Middle East is on fire, and it only promises to get worse in 2015. So who better to talk to about the world's most chaotic region than one of the world's leading Middle East analysts? Dr. Jonathan Spire is a senior research fellow at the Gloria Center in Herzliya, Israel, and a fellow at the Middle East Forum. He's also a columnist for the Jerusalem Post and the author of a great book called The Transforming Fire: The Rise of the Israel-Islamist Conflict. He's a wealth of knowledge on the Middle East and radical Islamic groups, as you'll see in our interview. Well, Jonathan, thanks so much for joining us. You know, 2014 in many ways was the year of the rise of ISIS. You've covered ISIS extensively. You've been on the ground throughout the Middle East. What is the status of ISIS right now? We know they have this mini caliphate they've declared in Syria and Iraq. Are they consolidating their gains right now? Are they set to expand? What is the state of ISIS right now?
Well, I would say that ISIS is not currently expanding, but it's expanded a great deal in the course of this year. Of course, erupting into Iraq across the border in June, and then again in August, and most importantly capturing the city of Mosul, you know, one of Iraq's most major cities, and holding on to that. And since then, of course, they've witnessed the commencement of US air campaign against them. And so the concern for ISIS really has been to keep hold of as much as it can of the areas it conquered in the course of the summer, and it has largely succeeded in doing so. ISIS is not currently expanding in a major way, but it is holding on to the area it's conquered, also in Iraq, and of course certainly also in Syria. It tried to destroy the Kurdish enclave in Kobani. It has largely succeeded in doing so, though it has not taken Kobani town, which became a symbolic target. So it has largely, it spread a lot in the course of the year. It provoked a reaction against it, and it has suffered a lot of deaths, a lot of losses, but it has not yet significantly lost ground. Yeah,
you know, I know ISIS made an incursion into Lebanon, ISIS and some other Syrian rebel and jihadist groups a few months ago. You know, Baghdadi, the ISIS Caliph, released a statement a few weeks ago saying, look, they want to drive into Saudi Arabia, Jordan. Obviously, they have their eyes on Baghdad. Do you think long-term, Jonathan, it's realistic that they could expand?
Yeah, I think they could expand certainly operations into Lebanon at a certain stage, because Lebanon is very vulnerable, and because the Syrian Sunnis and Syrian jihadis have a lot of support in the Bekaa, in the valley area immediately across the border from Syria. So they've been trying to push into them together with Jabhat al-Nusra, as you mentioned. Nusra being the official franchise of al-Qaeda leadership in Syria. They made some incursions there also in August, also later on in the year. Kidnapped a large number of Lebanese soldiers, still holding 25 of them. So I think Lebanon is particularly vulnerable. My sense is that Jordan and Saudi Arabia could be a bit much for them right now because they have much better defended borders, much more serious armed forces. And I think also in the case of Jordan that both the United States and Israel would be there to guarantee Jordan's border security. And I suspect that would be the case with Saudi Arabia too. So I think they need to be a bit careful about not letting their appetites get ahead of themselves. But certainly in terms of expanding their war westwards into Lebanon, I think we've already seen that beginning to happen in a major way in the course of this year. I think it's probably set to continue to happen. And one of the things I found particularly interesting about the incursions into Lebanon was that it's in that area where you found ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra actually working together in tandem. In other parts of Syria, they've clashed with one another, they have differing interests. But when it came to pushing into Lebanon, they found ways to work together. And that's something we should also be noting and bearing in mind, I think.
Yeah, I want to ask you a bit more about that, Jonathan. In terms of Jabhat al-Nusra, this is a group you've covered extensively in your writings, your analysis. A lot of people here in the West sometimes forget about Jabhat al-Nusra, that Syrian al-Qaeda affiliate. They've been overshadowed somewhat by ISIS, but they control a pretty large amount of territory now, too, in Syria as well, right?
Well, they do, because in November, they turned their attention against other rebel forces in northwest Syria, in Idlib province, with whom they had been working in cooperation prior to that. And they conquered a whole bunch of villages and a large area of Idlib province from a group called Syrian Revolutionaries Front, which had in fact been the beneficiary of Western aid and Western arms. So quite a bit of Western armament also fell into Nusra's hands at that time. They haven't declared a caliphate, and they're not going to declare a caliphate, I'd say. But practically, they control an area of ground in the same way that ISIS do. And my sense is that while the West may have forgotten about them, the Sunni populations of Syria and Lebanon have not forgotten about them. And many Sunnis feel that Nusra is a more pragmatic, more long-term, more strategic organization than is ISIS. And when the Sunnis are looking for protection, so to speak, against Hezbollah and against Assad, it's very possible, I think, that they're likely to turn to Nusra in larger numbers rather than ISIS, because ISIS is seen a little bit as a crazy group of people coming from outside the neighborhood, outside the region, whereas Nusra is seen as very much a homegrown force. So I think we should be keeping a very close eye on that organization. I think it's a very serious group of people.
That's a great point. It's interesting you mentioned how these outsiders, thousands of foreign fighters obviously flooding into ISIS's ranks. Up next, more with Dr. Jonathan Spire. Stick around. Jonathan, you kind of alluded to this earlier. Do you see a possibility that al-Nusra and ISIS could come into some sort of alliance? Obviously, they've been at each other's throats frequently. That's the first part of the question. Second part of the question is, ISIS has declared this caliphate. Who has signed on to this caliphate in the global jihadi world? Who has pledged allegiance to ISIS? Anyone significant?
With regard to the first part of the question, I tend to think that these organizations will manage to work together pragmatically in particular areas of cooperation, but that generally they will remain opposed to one another. I don't think there's any likelihood of them joining up together and becoming a single organization. After all, both of them came out of al-Qaeda. Nusra remains the official franchise of al-Qaeda. ISIS, to a certain degree, kind of rebelling against the core al-Qaeda leadership, and I can't really see that being resolved anytime soon. But I do think they'll continue to work together where they can, pragmatically, where they kind of see a common interest. With regard to pledges of allegiance, so to speak, to the Islamic State, well, a whole bunch of important jihadi organizations have pledged. A number of other unimportant ones have tried. The Islamic State doesn't accept every attempt to pledge loyalty to it, bay'ah to it, as they say in Arabic. But I would say a number of significant ones. First of all, in a town called Derna in Libya, an important Islamist group there has pledged loyalty. I think perhaps most importantly for us, at least here in Israel, an organization called Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis, a very important jihadi group operating in northern Sinai, just recently pledged loyalty to the Islamic State.
Right on Israel's border.
Accepted. They've now renamed themselves. Right on Israel's border, they now rename themselves Wilayat Sinai, which means the Sinai governorate, so to speak, or province of the Islamic State. And this is a very important join up because it means that jihadis, Sunni jihadis, are now on two of Israel's borders. Firstly, on the just east of the Quneitra crossing on the Israel-Syria border, which is Nusrat there, and now also in northern Sinai, Ansar Bait al-Maqdis.
Wow. A very important development, as you said. Now, Jonathan, shifting gears a bit to kind of the Shia axis of jihad, it seems that 2014 was a pretty good year for Iran. I have to say, the Iranian regime has its tentacles now in 4 Arab capitals. Tell us the state of things with Iran's footprint in the region right now.
Well, the Iranians have done well. They've had a good year. They've had a good year, of course, we should remember also in terms of the nuclear negotiation.
Absolutely.
With the West. They've met with the P5+1. They managed to drag that out while carrying on the uranium enrichment and the research in ballistic missiles, their program they've got going there. With regard to the regional outreach, so to speak, yeah, first of all, their man in Syria, Assad, has held on, of course, and they've reinforced him, and he's showing no signs of going anywhere anytime soon. They're maintaining their domination of Lebanon through the Hezbollah organization. No sign of that cracking anytime soon. In Iraq, they've held on to control of the government there, I would say, in my estimation. That's to say, Maliki's gone, but Haider al-Abadi, the new prime minister, is also a member of the Dawa party, a Shia Islamist party. None other than General Qasem Soleimani of the Revolutionary Guards Corps is on the ground in Iraq right now, helping the Iraqis to rebuild their army.
A very important
Shia
player is Soleimani.
Sectarian lines to make war against ISIS. Very, very important, a key operative in the Middle East. And so in Iraq, they're maintaining their position. And in Yemen, their proxy organization, or their client organization there, the Houthi Shia rebels, have effectively taken control of the capital city of Sana'a and are spreading their control right now. So yeah, it's been a good year in terms of Iran's proxies.
Yeah. In terms of Iran's proxies, Jonathan, just picking up on that, Hezbollah, kind of flying under the radar screen in a sense. Again, everyone's overshadowed here in the West in media coverage by ISIS these days. But Hezbollah is still a very formidable foe, very involved in Syria, even apparently on the ground in Iraq. Where is Hezbollah right now in terms of its strength? And has Hezbollah's experience in Syria fighting on the ground there, has that helped or hurt the organization overall?
Well, that's an interesting question. That's really a key question, and it's not an easy one to answer because there's evidence on both sides. Hezbollah has lost, we think, up to about 1,000 fighters now in Syria over the last 3 years. That's a lot of people for an organization that only has probably around 25,000 fighters, you know, on the books, so to speak. So they've lost a lot of men, and that includes also some senior commanders, some well-known guys who've died in there, not only rank and file men. So on the one hand, they've lost a lot of very important assets in there. On the other hand, they've certainly acquired a whole bunch of new skills. Firstly, in terms of fighting in built-up areas, which has not been Hezbollah's main specialty in the past. Secondly, learning to fight in areas which they don't know well, a long way away from their logistical base, a long way away from home. They've now learned that as well. So they've learned important new skills, but they've lost a lot of men. They've also lost a certain amount of standing in Lebanon, where a lot of people, including Shia Lebanese themselves, you know, are confused and baffled at why Hezbollah, you know, has chosen to involve Lebanon, so to speak, in the Syrian civil war. Of course, Hezbollah having no choice about it. They get an order from Tehran, they have to obey it. They're not an independent actor. But from the Lebanese point of view, this is a dangerous game that Hezbollah is playing. And we're already starting to see, or they're already starting to see the comeback for that as the Sunni Syrian jihadis, Nusra and ISIS, attempt to carry out operations on Lebanese soil, and indeed have done so on a number of occasions in the last year.
Very interesting. And of course, Israel is casting a wary eye towards all of this. Jonathan, we have about a minute left. 2015, looking into your crystal ball, any developments we should keep an eye on in the coming year?
Well, I think that Iraq is going to be absolutely crucial, and I think we should be watching very, very carefully the actions of the Shia militias in Iraq and the actions of the Iranians behind them in terms of building up the Shia militias, because in Syria, that's how the Iranians saved the regime, by building them up a new militia-based armed forces. And I think the West should be keeping a close eye on what's happening in Iraq, especially because in 2015 we're going to be seeing a larger deployment of Western armed forces, both in the air and on the ground in Iraq, and we should be careful that that deployment doesn't end up helping the Iranians rather than helping the Western interest.
Absolutely. Just because Iran is opposing ISIS right now doesn't mean Iran is an ally in any sense. Jonathan Spire, thank you so much. Always a pleasure to talk to you. Coming up, I look into my crystal ball and give you my final thoughts on what to watch for in 2015. Stick around. If you want to understand the war on terror, you must first understand the Muslim Brotherhood. Pick up my new book, The Brotherhood, America's Next Great Enemy, Available at Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, and wherever books are sold from coast to coast. And welcome back. Well, if you thought 2014 was a crazy year, you ain't seen nothing yet. Fasten your seatbelt because 2015 promises to be a wild one. Here are the three things that I'm watching in the Middle East jihad, national, global security realm. Number one, Iran's nuclear weapons program. Folks, the Obama administration, Europe, they're very eager to cut a bad deal with Iran. Basically, they want a deal at all costs. That means that Iran is going to laugh its way to a nuclear weapon. Only one country is going to stop Iran from acquiring that nuclear capability, and guess who it is? It's not the United States. The military option has been taken off the table by the Obama administration in everything but words. Only Israel can stop that Iranian nuclear weapons program. It's not fair. It shouldn't be up to Israel, but that's how it's going to play out, folks, especially if Prime Minister Netanyahu wins elections in March and is reelected as Israeli Prime Minister. I do not believe he will allow Iran to go nuclear. Number two, watch for the rise of ISIS. Of course, ISIS continues to attempt to expand that caliphate in the heart of the Middle East. Especially watch again for those self-starter, lone wolf ISIS sympathizers striking here in our backyard in the West. It is a major problem. Number three, look to Russia. Vladimir Putin's Russia, as I speak at the end of 2014 here, their economy is about to collapse. This could be very dangerous. Putin could go on a foreign adventure. Keep an eye on those three things, folks. In the meantime, do not fear. God still sits on the throne. And what a time to be alive, because we're seeing prophecy unfold before our very eyes. We have a front row seat. Thanks for joining me here in 2014. Looking forward to being with you in 2015. Until next time, God bless you, and remember, never hold your peace.